how to keep the technological advantage and build digital security so that democracies prevail in competition with the authoritarian regimes. What is the best response to the competition between authoritarian and democratic capital?
Technology, innovation, and digitalization are shaping a new global order. In fact, we can talk about the impact of technological disruption in the global order in three main areas: power relations, the economic, labor, and social model, and individual rights and freedoms.
We are in the middle of a change, a digital transformation. And beside the Green Deal, what we need is a digital New Deal. We need this for the next generations, not only in Europe, but worldwide.
Hello, everyone. I am Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today, our final and third day of CEPA Forum 2021, Fit to Lead, Renewing the Transatlantic Alliance in a Contested World. Today, we turn to transatlantic cooperation on digital innovation and tech policy. I'd like to extend a special thank you to our supporters for this year's forum: Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. A special thank you also to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. And to our media partners that have joined us for this year's forum, thank you to Defense One, Euractiv, and Politico. For those of you that are following along today's discussions, be sure to use hashtag #FitToLead or go to cepa.org, cepaforum.org, and follow us across all of our social media platforms to follow today's events. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, as she introduces today's distinguished opening keynote. Over to you, Alina.
Good morning, and welcome to Day 3 of the 2021 CEPA Forum. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. Today, we will focus on the transformation of the global order by technology. As we have seen, the race for digital innovation has come to define and shape geopolitics, with Chinese technology companies now innovating rather than copying and mimicking Western technologies. Beijing's expansive surveillance state at home has left Europe and the United States struggling to understand how we can retain our competitive edge going forward. One thing is clear: Europe and the United States must work together to craft effective approaches to tech policy to build a proper and strong digital alliance. On both sides of the Atlantic, digital innovation is playing a starring role in the continued promotion of democratic values of openness, opportunity, and inclusivity. A democratic internet can only be maintained through collaboration, not data protectionism. And emerging technologies must be built on common guidelines from a multi-stakeholder consensus. Most importantly, challenges to digital authoritarianism must come from one voice rather than a discordant many. Today, we look forward to bringing you the voices leading the way in democratic digital innovation, from elected leaders in civil society to tech entrepreneurs and innovators. Our speakers today will present a forward-looking vision on how to ensure a democratic digital domain. Let's get the discussion started. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Her Excellency Kaja Kallas, Prime Minister of the Republic of Estonia. In the 30 years since the restoration of its independence, Estonia has become one of the most digitally sophisticated countries in the world. Estonia leads the world on e-governance, and it was the first country to hold elections over the internet. Internationally, Estonia is a key advocate for increased digital connectivity, securing digital infrastructure and promoting a democratic internet. Prime Minister Kallas's leadership has been instrumental in these efforts. Her career has been dedicated to leading for digital innovation, working both on the digital single market as a member of the European Parliament and as a rapporteur for the e-privacy regulation and legislation on AI and competition policy. Prime Minister Kallas has been in office since January of this year, and already she has accomplished a great deal as the head of her government. I am honored to have you with us today. Prime Minister Kallas, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, some weeks ago, we ended the Lennart Meri Foreign Policy Conference in Estonia, where Carl Bildt, a former Prime Minister of Sweden, concluded, and I quote, "The world, in some way, at least, might be on fire, but we need to concentrate our minds on keeping our house safe." End of quote. Keeping us safe demands to adapt and update our policies, be it for protecting our health, our climate or planet, or to ensure technology improves our lives and democracy delivers. The key question we will be asking is how to navigate the digital future so that it will be kept safe and prosperous. Our digital transformation here in Estonia began in parallel with the building of liberal democracy. This meant building trust in our political and legal system. We learned that success and innovation demand trust and transparency. Trust and transparency between governments and citizens, between the private and the public sector, between us and our international friends and partners. We also learned that in the digital era, a country's size matters less than its capacity to innovate. Now Estonia hopes to build trust at international level. That is why I hosted on the 7th of September this year the 4th Tallinn Digital Summit. We discussed how to unite the free world via safe and digital infrastructure. For the purpose, we have identified the key questions of the 21st century. How to keep the technological advantage and build digital security so that democracies prevail in competition with the authoritarian regimes. What is the best response to the competition between authoritarian and democratic capital? How to secure the development of new technologies based on our shared democratic values? The shared democratic values of the free world, openness, transparency, and the protection of individual rights, form the ideological basis for the set of rules and policies which we suggested to brand under the term trusted connectivity. Our collective concern at the Digital Summit gave rise to the Tallinn Consensus on Trusted Connectivity, a unifying framework to improve the cooperation of the free world on global connectivity policy. Now the question is how to put trusted connectivity into practice. Based on the conversations between global leaders in Tallinn, I suggested the following. First, democratic countries must forge trusted connectivity partnerships among each other and with emerging economies. The European Union, the G7 and the Indo-Pacific Quad nations must take charge in this effort. The EU and the US in particular are well positioned to expedite the trusted connectivity partnership, in addition to seeking policy alignment on international data transfers and data flows through the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. Second, These partnerships should be employed to improve existing and establish new financing mechanisms to better utilize public and private investments into digital and physical infrastructure projects based on the principles of trusted connectivity. Third, we should better advertise various existing public and private infrastructure investments based on our common values and use the trusted connectivity as a global brand. Fourth, we need a branding tool to certify that particular infrastructure project adheres to the principles of trusted connectivity. Such a tool is already being developed at the OECD, the Blue Dot Network. The Blue Dot would be a certification of excellence and manifestation of the trusted connectivity at the level of individual infrastructure projects. And fifth, such tools need maintenance. The governance of tools such as Blue Dot Network must be simple, adoptable, and future-proof. This is best accomplished by finding a better balance between traditional systems based on hierarchy and novel systems based on networks. The adoption and deployment of new modes of operation, those more flexible and innovative, will be one of the keys to our success in the 21st century. We have a common interest in ensuring the competitiveness, prosperity, and resilience of democratic countries. By setting the rules of the game, democratic governments can facilitate trust, investments, and innovation. Equipped with interoperable and complementary financing mechanisms, we allow ourselves to harness our unparalleled economic clout, the engine of which is the private sector. Trust is essential to attracting public, quasi-public, and private investments, enabling democracies to respond to the global demand for infrastructure. Let me conclude by saying that the wildcard that will determine our success will be digital global governance and our capacity to deliver and share common digital public infrastructure. The delivery of public services to our citizens is already much different than it was just a few years back. Now, digital governance expertise has globally matured to a point where it can be shared more easily across borders. We need to harmonize the principles of taxonomy, promote open, standard-based reusability, and share know-how and capacity. As an example, this is precisely how Estonia and Finland, our good friends in the north, are able to share so many automated cross-border services. I hope that the principles of trusted connectivity will contribute to your discussions today and to our cooperation tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Kallas, for joining us at this year's CEPA Forum and for kicking off today's discussions. Before I introduce the next conversation, let me bring back up Slido.com, a way that you, our audience at home, can engage with today's conversations by participating in our polls, word clouds. And I am about to introduce poll 1. How can the Transatlantic Alliance incentivize digital innovation? Again, the question is, how can the Transatlantic Alliance incentivize digital innovation? Our answers there are invest in research and development, regulate big tech, increase workforce education, and deregulate tech industry. Please go ahead and go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA, or scan the QR code on your screen to participate. We'll show the results later on in the conversation. And now I am delighted to welcome back our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, as she has a conversation with Eric Schmidt, former CEO and chair of Google. Is the West fit to lead in technology is the theme. Over to you, Alina.
Hello, I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, coming to you from Washington. And I'm truly honored to have the pleasure of introducing Eric Schmidt. and hosting this conversation with him today. Eric probably requires no introduction to most of you tuning in, but very briefly, he is an accomplished technologist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. Of course, Eric was perhaps best known as the CEO and chairman of Google, where he served in that capacity for 10 years, from 2001 to 2011, and worked very closely with the founders to build the company from a startup, which is hard to believe that Google was a startup, but that very much has a lot to do with Eric's leadership in the company during that really critical period. He remained the executive chairman of Alphabet for 3 years between 2015 and 2018, and then founded a philanthropic organization, Schmidt Futures, in 2017. Eric is also a writer. He's published 3 New York Times best-selling books. He hosts a podcast that I encourage everyone to check out called Reimagine with Eric Schmidt that covers a whole slew of incredibly fascinating topics. And in his foreign policy, national security hat, Eric has been an advocate for integrating new technology and innovation into our national security infrastructure. He served as the chairman of the Department of Defense's Innovation Board, as well as a member of NASA's National Space Council, User Advisory Group, and he is the chairman of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which just published a very interesting report with some of its key recommendations around competition on AI. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. It's really wonderful to see you.
No, thank you. And I very much like what CEPA is doing. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, thanks, Eric. So I want to just get right into it. You've talked quite a bit in the past about China. In fact, I think you've been very much a leading voice in alerting the public policy community on China's growing capabilities and capacity and technologies. And I've often heard you say that China is generations ahead of the West in some certain technologies, such as facial recognition. On the other hand, I think you have a very interesting and nuanced view of how the United States should approach China when it comes to technology competition. You've talked about China both being a rival and a partner. So I wanted to get you to tease that out a little bit. Obviously, China is top of the foreign policy and national security agenda today, both in the United States, increasingly in Europe. But are we still falling behind? And by how much? What is that gap as you see it today in some specific tech areas that you know well? And how should we be thinking about China? How does the rivalry partnership dynamic actually work in practice?
I think the biggest thing I've noticed in the last few years is people have finally figured out that China has caught up. There's a view in America that we are exceptional and ahead of everyone else. This was forged, I think, largely after World War II. And so the arrival on scene of a full and direct competitor in key areas, one of scale who's executing well, is sort of a shock to the system. And I think what I've noticed in the last few years is people are slowly grappling what it means to having another large competitor in the space. Notice I didn't say enemy, I said competitor. And I think my own view is that for the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have an incredibly uncomfortable relationship with China. Uncomfortable in the sense of they're going to push and push and push in ways that we don't like and the way we don't find correct. However, they'll be pushing toward global dominance of technologies that they've laid out that we need to dominate instead. Right before the pandemic, China issued a statement, I'll summarize, on the 70th occasion of the party, that they wanted to dominate AI, semiconductors, energy, transportation, quantum, synthetic biology. Well, that's the entire world that I work in. That's the world of technology platforms that will create trillions of dollars of new companies, new wealth in the West or in China, or maybe in both. And we have a number of examples now, the most interesting one being basically ByteDance, which is the parent company of TikTok, that is probably the most valuable private company in the world and growing very fast. A valuation probably close to $500 billion. How did this happen? 5 years ago, people did not even think China could pull off any global platforms. Look at the Huawei fight, and Huawei dominating the 5G space at the moment. How did that happen? It happened because we weren't paying attention. We weren't focused on these key areas.
Well, I think we're certainly paying it more attention now. But I think the question is, you're saying that China has caught up now with innovation in certain tech areas. So what is our competitive edge? You know, I still see that in terms of research on artificial intelligence in particular, you know, the US and China are increasingly closing that gap in terms of research publications anyways. But where are we still competitive? So where are we on par? Where is there still, where's China outpacing us? And where do we still have the competitive edge?
Well, as an example, we looked in the commission very carefully at the AI situation. China is producing more AI papers than the United States. But if you look at the top papers, they tend to be from the West, and the Chinese ones are not as highly rated. But then if you look at the very top papers, they often have 5-ish authors, and often one of those authors is Chinese born. So it looks to me like the field is moving forward in the West, with the Chinese following very closely behind, and that the Chinese, in the form of immigrants, people outside of China, are significant contributors to this forefront. If we go through the other industries, it's probably the case that China is ahead in ride sharing and technologies like that. We know they're ahead by a couple generations in facial recognition and surveillance. And they're almost certainly a couple generations ahead in electronic commerce for consumers, well ahead of Europe, which is well ahead of America. And the easiest way to understand that is that China has become a cashless society. When you walk into any store, there is a complicated protocol involving your phone, typically WeChat, with another phone or service within the store that both orders, provisions, and fulfills whatever you're doing. Now you sit there and you go, well, that's really cool. And by the way, it's super impressive. The most recent trip I had in China, I watched this. My friend said he hadn't carried or used cash in 2 years. Can you imagine that? Mm-hmm. But it's also consistent with their surveillance methodology, because it means that there's a very large amount of tracking and positioning information that they can use for public safety, national security, and oppression if they wish.
Well, let's just get into that element of what you just highlighted, that China is perhaps outpacing in some ways, though it's uneven development, as you just said, Western innovation from the United States and certainly from Europe. And we'll get to Europe later in the conversation, so I know you have some thoughts about that. But the use of these technologies, meaning what is the purposing? What are they being deployed towards? And this is a huge concern, because obviously in democratic societies, we have a lot of concern about how data is being used. But of course, in China, with the kind of state that the CCP has established, there's no concern of data privacy. You have no data privacy de facto in China. And so the question is if China is able to build these quite advanced and sophisticated technologies on the basis of what is a very pernicious and pervasive digital surveillance, a digital authoritarian state, how can the private sector from the United States really compete with that when we have so many concerns about privacy and human rights?
Well, I would argue that this is fundamentally a values competition, and that the societal values in China are just different. All accounts indicate that the average Chinese person is relatively happy with the environment around them, even though there are restrictions on their expression of political views, et cetera. So it looks like Chinese nationalism combined with the pride of their country, combined with lack of information that they get, has allowed them to focus on the things that they care about, which appear to me to be economic growth, feeling good about their country, feeling good about the power that they have, and those sorts of things. It's not at all obvious to me what happens next. The Chinese Communist Party is not going to make this more liberal. They're not going to all of a sudden allow the equivalent of Facebook and Twitter with unauthenticated messages. So you have now finally a real test of centralization and decentralization. The Chinese model is a highly centralized model, highly centrally controlled, much more so since March of this year, when they began to crack down on the Chinese tech leadership, and I suspect that will continue. So, my own opinion is that Chinese entrepreneurship will still do well, even with those constraints. Mm. In the U.S., we spend an awful lot of time arguing on the edges of issues, when we fail to recognize that across the Atlantic, we actually agree on almost everything. We agree on, let's start, the rights of minorities, the right of political expression, the right of freedom of movement. In general terms, the lack of surveillance, at least from others, and in some cases from the government. So it looks to me like you've got a competition of two systems. The message today, I've always assumed that the Western system, which is confusing and overlapping and so forth, but hugely creative and produce the most extraordinary universities. I always assumed that we would stay well ahead. I'm worried now that even in these key areas, we'll only be one generation ahead. And if we make mistakes, like we did with 5G, where we didn't give out the right amount of frequencies and so forth and so on, we can be permanently behind.
So, on your point about values and the fact that we actually agree on quite a lot of things, but still find ourselves in conflict, maybe some of the key details, especially when it comes to the relationship between Europe and the United States. You know, one thing that I have found really interesting about some of the things you've said before is, one, how values, one way in which values propagate and dominate the world is, of course, now in the 21st century through technology and through the adoption of certain technologies. And you mentioned this growing repression in China by the CCP of their own companies that have gone perhaps a little too free, have gone a little too rogue, and have slipped out from under state control. And I agree, we're going to continue to see that kind of crackdown happen in the foreseeable future. But then if we're seeing a propagation of values through technology, and Western technologies, which presumably, you know, are come inherently embedded with values of openness and interoperable internet, the Western-led model of what a free and open internet should be, if those technologies and companies are increasingly being locked out of the Chinese market, of the Russian market, although not quite there yet, other countries are likely going to follow suit, especially where we have authoritarian leaders. So if this is really about an ideological competition and a values-based competition where technology plays a key role, where do we currently find ourselves in that balance? Are we on the back foot, or do you think we still have the edge when it comes to values and when it comes to technology being the sort of the water through which those values travel globally?
Well, the platforms that we build reflect the values often of the tech company that invented it. And so in my 19 years at Google, we faced issue after issue because Google would show up in a country, and the way Google worked, and particularly with respect to sort of an American view of openness of information, lack of responsibility, we were willing to tolerate anonymity in terms of submissions. You could view that as American hegemony. You could, for example, in Europe, many European nations were furious that things would happen on the American platforms, including Google, but they didn't have the ability to enforce their laws by taking the CEO of the company and putting them in jail, or similar threats from law enforcement or judges. And we've gotten away with this because the American technology sector was so powerful that even though Europe, which is a fantastic place, Europe has been forced, if you will, to adopt many of the American properties in these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth. We tried the same thing in China and we were blocked. So it's not clear to me that we're going to have much impact on how the Chinese information space evolves. If you're a Chinese citizen today, you use WeChat to invoke apps. You use Alipay and other things like that to buy things all automatically. The vast majority of the Western information is highly censored, or it is blocked in such a way that even VPNs make it difficult to get to, and there are some exceptions. So a reasonable expectation is these two paths will devolve over time, that the information spaces in the China and the BRI countries and the West will diverge. And that's okay as long as the divergence doesn't lead to conflict, right? It's okay for people to have their own cultural values. And I think we in the internet industry just sort of assumed that we could prance into these countries with internet values. And much of our language, certainly mine during that period, was to do that. And I think this is a case where the governments are fighting back. They're saying, we want to control the internet and our borders. Now, one way to think about this is that 10 years ago, I used to give this speech where I would say, the internet is optional. You have an off button, just turn it off. Well, no one would say that today after the pandemic, where the internet became central to food, health, and education, and the daily lives of citizens all around the world because of the internet. So we shouldn't be so naive to think the governments are not going to react. The question now is, what is the penalty of that overreaction? China, for example, has just made it impossible to list your tech company on a US market, presumably because they don't want US dollars going out of the system, and by listing that as a way of monetizing in US dollars. I don't really know. Maybe no one knows. Will that really affect the entrepreneurial nature of China? They're betting it's not.
Well, you already brought up Europe a few times, so I want to dig into that a little bit because certainly Europe, while we can all agree is a wonderful place to visit and it has a lot of great attributes, is trailing behind in terms of technology innovation. There's no secret about that. The Europeans, and certainly Brussels, has recognized that. And perhaps as a response to the kind of domination that we've seen of US companies in particular, that you've been alluding to as well, we've now seen a bit of a backlash, certainly in Brussels, with new legislative proposals and efforts to try to perhaps rein in certainly so-called big tech, which is primarily US companies, but it seems like there's still less of an attention to Chinese firms in Europe when it comes to competition. So I guess my question to you is, do you think Europe is heading in the right direction? It's certainly not a continent that can really tout its digital or technological innovation. There's not a huge number. There's some very good European tech companies, but certainly cannot compete with the United States, and increasingly cannot compete with China. And so can Europe really be this global regulator of technology without being a global innovator in technology? How do we think about that?
It seems to me that the third prize in the competition is you become the regulator. And in my world, first and second are the only positions that matter. I'm quite worried that this bias toward regulation, which I've dealt with for my whole life in Europe, is reaching a new ultimate outcome. And the best example here is the proposed AI regulation that Brussels just issued. Now, the key part of this, it's all very sensible. It's written in European public policy language. Oh, we want this, we want that, and so forth. In the middle of it, it says that for critical infrastructure, you cannot deploy it unless the AI system can explain itself. Well, let me tell you right now, there is no AI system today that can explain itself at the level that that would apply. The technology is just not there.
Mm-hmm.
And in case you're wondering, we allow teenage boys at age 16 to drive cars, and they can't explain themselves either, right? Speaking as a former teenage boy. So we've got to come up with some way where we get the values that we care about without a regulation like the one I just described that guarantees that Europe will never catch up to the West. So you've got this huge fight, right? Immense fight, US versus China. The US needs partners, and the partners need to be Europe, they need to be Australia, they need to be Japan, South Korea, they need to be UK, and they need to be working hand in hand in hand. And so this lead with regulation is really dangerous. And I think a reasonable critic would say that European tech companies, there may be an exception or two, are going to become regulated regional champions. As the regulation bias occurs in Europe, and there's plenty of reasons to have regulation, the rules will get more and more specialized. And you'll have lots of regional champions, and there'll be big companies. Maybe they'll be unicorns, maybe they'll be worth billions of dollars, but they're not going to drive global platforms.
Right.
And that's where the game is won. So the contest over who gets to set these global platforms and global standards is the one I've been privileged to compete in for my whole career. And that's the one I don't want to lose to China. And I'd like Europe to do it with the US.
So on the transatlantic connection there, for years, and you're speaking to this in your comment just now, Europe and the United States, we've been diverging when it comes to tech policy. We've seen Europe take one tact with some of the proposals just described. And in the US, I think only now are we starting to pick up our thinking on what makes sense in terms of our ability to regulate our own companies so that Brussels isn't doing it for us, basically. How do we have a uniform playing field when it comes to regulation? But also, how do we more closely and try to close the divergence we have developed between the European approach and will emerge as the US approach? So it means a bit unclear what the regulatory approach will be in the United States. And President Biden has done this wonderful trip to Europe where there was a bit of a charm offensive some months ago, earlier this year. And one of the outcomes of that was to establish this Trade and Technology Council. Not a new idea, it's been around, but now's the idea is to re-energize it. But what do you think should be the top priorities for a cooperation between Europe and the United States?
Well, in the AI report that the commission I was chairman of issued, we talk a lot about the importance of having such an entity. We specifically propose that the State Department have a whole directorate in the United States about working and aligning technology policy across the Atlantic for all the reasons that you could imagine. I think what President Biden is doing is exactly right. A lot of this will depend on whether the TTC or the ETC and the various other proposals, there's something called a T10, something called a T12. They're all similar in that what they're trying to do is they're trying to get people to talk to each other to agree on common norms. And this is crucial, in my view, to us collaborating together. I worry, however, that our internal fighting, the way we operate both among countries and within the country, will hobble our technology offerings while China does not have the same problem. And so the problem I have with, you use the word regulation. If the regulator's title was regulate and grow at the same time, I would be a lot happier. If they had a dual mandate to both grow the economy, grow the products, grow the impact in a good way, as well as regulate the downside, that would be a better model. The recent regulation moves in the United States are not a surprise to me, but there's not agreement on what they should be. So my guess is it'll be a fairly long and complicated process. And I'm worried again that our sort of self-loathing behavior where we spend all of our time complaining about ourselves, we'll miss the big picture that whatever's going on in China is occurring very rapidly. An example, the most recent report, 720 million users of 5G in China. They are building literally hundreds of thousands of towers. They're on the way to having 1.2 million 5G towers. Those numbers, by my estimate, are at least a factor of 10 ahead of the West. Now, you say, well, I don't really mind having slow internet. I don't really use it that much. But what you will be upset about is if a set of applications are built in China that are enabled by that 5G platform that are not available in the West. And those are killer applications. They're really good applications. So what happens when you lose platform leadership? Platforms are things you build on, right? The things that are built on it go somewhere else. Synthetic biology. China has a large initiative around a national biobank for everything. A biobank is where you store information about how life works. Think of it as DNA sequences and other things like that. We don't have an analogous program in the West, although there are people, there's a UK biobank, which is pretty good, and there are people working on this. So is that an area where we're going to be behind too? Can you imagine if China could build all of the interesting drugs and all of the interesting materials and all of that using synthetic biology, and we're behind, and we invented this stuff? That's my point. We're not focused on the stuff that matters. I'm perfectly happy to have people argue over steel prices and trade and subsidies and so forth. That's the battle of 30 years ago. The new battle, synthetic biology, AI, quantum, energy systems, software platforms, that sort of thing.
So what I'm hearing you say is we need to have the bigger picture in mind. Focus, start with the values. And every time we have a conflict over a detail like transatlantic data flows, for example, which has become a unnecessarily huge issue, that we need to constantly keep in mind what the bigger picture is and what the bigger objective is.
Let me give you my pet peeve. So 12 years ago or so, Europe decided that everyone had to give consent to use cookies. So when you're in Europe, every website asks you for consent. And you can be quite sure that every European ignores the complicated language and just says yes, because they want to get to their outcome. If you sum the amount of time wasted by Europeans with that single click, you would say, maybe we could achieve this political or regulatory objective in a less intrusive way. Now, I know that sounds stupid, but my guess is if you take the time of 800 million people, you're going to get a pretty big number. So this is what happens when you have privacy regulators who are strong-minded, and in many cases I agree with, they overstep.
Yeah.
That's why if we're going to do this collectively, we've got to continue to focus on what the objective is. My objective is very simple. I want the next 10 trillion-dollar platforms to be invented in the West and not in China. Right. We have lost surveillance. That's probably okay. We may have lost electronic commerce. That's not okay. We may have lost 5G. That's not okay. I don't know what's going to happen with entertainment, but at the rate at which TikTok is growing, what do you think is going to happen when China discovers that it can influence the habits and thoughts of the world's teenagers? Can't be a good outcome for the West.
So Eric, I know that you're a chess player, and basically what you're describing is a chessboard right now where we know, so Beijing has telegraphed to us basically what their next moves are going to be, at least through 2030 and probably beyond. But we're still not fully listening or acknowledging that strategy. And the chessboard, from what you've described it and some of the ways in which we are falling behind in these key areas, we really seem to be losing the game right now. So if you put on your chess player hat and you have to think about, if we have lost surveillance, electronic commerce, potentially, 5G, potentially entertainment. What is that next thing on the horizon that we really need to be focusing on to try to get ahead of the game?
The ones I think are the ones that have the biggest impact are probably energy, synthetic bio, and essentially software platforms AI. And the reason is that for each of them, energy is an enormous industry with enormous implications, which is now being, in many cases, being led in China. It's crucial for the next 100 years for all the reasons that we know, et cetera. Synthetic biology is at its infancy. It's like where computer chip design was in the 1980s. And looking at the 40 years since that stuff happened with two fellows named Conway and Mead, you understand how powerful synthetic biology could be over the rest of our lifetimes. AI is profound because AI allows you to rethink how you do science. Mm-hmm. AI enables new drugs, new protein foldings, new chemistry, new material science. It's at the root of almost everything involving manufacturing and healthcare. These are enormous industries. And I'm not even talking about education and the way the government works and all the other things. So if you have to win, you better, if you have to fight to win, you better win those. I'm fairly convinced that we've lost the 5G battle. And the reason is we just haven't moved fast enough. But there may be a strategy around leadership in 6G, we'll see.
Interesting. What strikes me about everything you just laid out is, of course, something that I know you've also thought a lot about and was a big part of the NSCI report as well, which is talent. To be the leader on all of these fronts, we need to make sure we have the technical skills and we have people who are interested in these fields and who are getting the right skill sets. And one big issue when it comes to at least governments, US governments and European governments' ability to know where we should be investing and how is the shortage of skilled, technically educated young people and individuals that are going to government service. And of course, the fact that we still have the best universities in the world, but of course, many from China and other places are coming to study in the United States, and then they're taking those skill sets back home. And it's not contributing in the whole to our growing long-term ability to innovate. So on the talent question, what can we do as perhaps the US government in this case to better recruit and train talent? What should be the US government's role in this, in the talent piece?
Well, our report spends quite a bit of time on this, and there's a lot of specifics. I think the first thing I would say is that we need more high skills immigration, more PhDs in math. If you think about a stable state of China versus the United States, China will have access to capital, access to markets, size of platforms, and so forth. The one thing it won't have is access to the world's talent, because people would prefer to live in a democracy and prefer to live and work in the United States than in China, unless they're Chinese. So that looks to me as a significant advantage. And we all understand the importance in America of immigration. I'll note that one of the co-founders of Google was a Jewish Russian immigrant family, for which he's very thankful that they let him out, first to Israel and then, of course, to the West. The second thing is that the government is not organized around the human skills here. The people who want to work in the government often can't get a job, they can't get an offer, the clearances take a year, all of these kinds of things, whereas the private sector will pay twice as much and do it immediately. So the government needs to organize itself around high skills talent. In our report, we propose a number of things. We propose a civilian university, which would be basically for tech talent. You would go to it for free in return for working for the government. We propose a 30-day a year leave program where you can actually work in the military for 30 days and then return to your relatively normal job. and a whole bunch of things around certificates and investment and promotions and separate tracks and things like that. It's as though the technology industry was forgotten by the government. The government viewed itself as nice, pleasant liberal arts people who mean well and understand policy. And they don't understand that the best way to fix a policy is to fix it with an engineering solution that actually solves the problem. And that bias, which is sort of my bias, is, I think, one that people generally agree with now, but the government is so slow moving, it's very difficult to make these changes without a lot of top-down pressure from the president, the vice president, secretary of defense, and all of the other groups.
So given everything that we've just discussed, maybe just one last big picture question, the challenges around skills and talent recruitment and training, the somewhat confused role of the government in this space in particular, China's ability to outpace the West on some of the core areas you discussed, and then some of the regulatory issues we've seen emerge in Europe and the overreach that you've been talking about. So I guess given everything you've laid out, where are you today on winning the bigger battle, making sure that the next platform, the multi-trillion-dollar platform, is invented in the West, the United States, or perhaps even Europe? Are you optimistic?
I'm less optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic yet. And I'll give you a positive example. Look at Operation Warp Speed. So President Trump and his team, using the private sector to build the vaccines, the universities to invent the underlying mRNA and other techniques, and the government procured whether the products worked or not in a time of national emergency. And by the way, it worked, and it worked well. We do have examples where when we face a challenge that's a focused challenge, an important challenge, we can come together to sort of drive this with the various elements. It requires top-down leadership. If our government, broadly speaking, spends its time in the usual local problems, which are all real, by the way, they're all local, they're all political, they're real, it affects the re-election and so forth, then I'm afraid that China, which is far more focused on this area, will begin to lead in these other areas. I think we have 3 to 5 years. We have more than a month or two, but we don't have a decade. China has published its goals of leadership. It's called Made in China 2025, where they want to make everything themselves. Leadership in key industries by 2030. So that's reasonably soon. And unless we do the kinds of things we're talking about now, which are more money for research, more focus on entrepreneurship, more collaboration among the West, focusing as much of the resources of the countries as we can on these key platform areas. And we can debate what they are, but everyone kind of agrees on the same list, broadly speaking, then we're going to lose. And the problem with when you lose in a network effect business, where networks drive participation, is once you start to lose, it's very difficult to catch up. That's been the truth for my whole career. And so that's why I said with 5G, I'm afraid that China's lead is so far ahead that we won't be able to catch up. How do we get there? We have to leapfrog. Do you really think we could leapfrog to a 6G ahead of them? Certainly not with the current tactics. That's an example of where we need a combined strategy, again, to review universities, the private sector, the governments, all in agreement that this is really important.
Well, I think we could go on for a long time in this conversation, but I want to be mindful of your time and the discussion we've already had. I certainly hope that based on what you said, you're seeing some concrete steps in this direction. And I do think this administration sees the bigger picture and hopefully will take on that kind of leadership that you're describing to really push for this whole of society, whole of democracy approach. And I hope that when we see some of the developments on the Summit for Democracy administration wants to host, the technology will be a big part of that as well, because we really cannot separate the values anymore from technological innovation and digitization more broadly. Eric, it was such a pleasure. I have so many more questions for you, But it was fantastic to see you. Thank you for laying out the vision you've developed, and thank you for all the work you've done trying to push our government in the right direction on these issues. I look forward to, I hope next time that we have an opportunity to pick up this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina. And again, I look forward to working with you all in the future, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Thank you, Alina, for that conversation. And now I turn it to colleagues from across the Atlantic. Cara Frederick, Research Fellow at the Center for Technology Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Jose Ignacio Torreblanca, Head of the Madrid office at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And our very own President Thomas Ilves, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Over to you.
The top priority for transatlantic cooperation on technology policy can be summed up in 3 words: global swing states. In particular, we can work together to help shape technology adoption in these countries by offering a better way than China's rapacious digital platforms and products now going global. Global swing states, or countries with large economies and regional wasta that exhibit both forms of democratic and illiberal governance at home, can act as weather vanes for the West. What India, Indonesia, Singapore, Brazil, and similar states will do matter considerably to the China challenge. Transatlantic democratic allies can make a compelling case here. But we must work together to actively engage these states and help create technologies and products these countries can use to counter an ascendant China, which is peddling its values through its own CCP-linked private digital platforms. We're all familiar with those challenges by now. China is normalizing encroachment on freedom of expression on private platforms outside of authoritarian regimes. We saw this when YouTube took down videos of Xinjiang testimonies from a Kazakh human rights channel this June. We saw this when Zoom acquiesced to pressure from Beijing over the account of a Chinese activist last year. And we saw this when Microsoft censored images of Tank Man on Bing. The party state has long used its own people as guinea pigs to advance its digital surveillance practices, but now citizens of the Western world are the new guinea pigs. This is untenable in free societies.
Technology, as we know, has become a key source of wealth and progress, but also a source of new vulnerabilities which are already being exploited by great powers to force countries to change their foreign policies and by authoritarian regimes to strengthen their grip on its citizens and weaken rival democracies. It is in this intersection of geopolitics, security interests, economic opportunities, and democratic values where the importance of the transatlantic relationship becomes vital, and where the recently created Trade and Technology Council offers an opportunity which must be seized.
When it comes to digital, because in many ways we're still stuck in the kinetic era, by which I mean that all aggression until basically the 21st century has been using kinetic means. Force equals mass times acceleration. In the digital world, there is no mass, there is no acceleration, there is no distance, there is no time, at least as long as you're on Earth, which means that organizations such as the geographically based North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, it is designed to be the North Atlantic, not out of ideological or like-mindedness grounds, but rather because of bomber range, tank logistics, troop transport. But in this digital era, digital threats can go anywhere almost instantaneously, and it doesn't really matter if you are Estonia, the United States, New Zealand, South Korea, we're all equally vulnerable, which means I think we have to rethink our entire security paradigm to deal with the digital era. This does not mean that kinetic threats, have gone away. The Russians are still invading and occupying territories in Ukraine and Georgia and the Central African Republic. But nonetheless, the point is we have this added dimension of digital warfare, and each country dealing with it on its own is not going to get very far. And moreover, we do have to expand the range of countries that are targets because of their commitment to liberal democracy. And I would see that as the main challenge for security policy in the future.
First, policy-wise, we must find areas of mutual cooperation with these global swing states and work together to build small wins and the muscle memory to go further. These areas can include digital trade, law enforcement response requests for data, and technical standards. We can also make use of other governance fora where these swing states are already active, like the Open Government Partnership. Number two, we should create good habits of our own. Transatlantic allies should enlist and support their own private tech companies to build commercial norms toward digital freedom. We must lead in privacy. We should design products with built-in privacy protections that act as a shield from authoritarian governments. Make differential privacy, data obfuscation, federated models of machine learning, make those the norm. We need to invest in privacy regimes. We need to normalize strong privacy practices within companies as well. 3, we need to use this privacy foundation as a launch point and seize the opportunity to shape the design of products that are used in these countries. Let a million different signals proliferate to make the world safe for democracy. And finally, we should support exchanges of these technologies between like-minded lovers of freedom, such as between Hong Kong's Umbrella Movement vets and Taiwan's Sunflower Movement leaders. Because a strategy aimed only at staunching the illiberal use of technology will fail in the long term. Instead, we can purvey that affirmative agenda to counter the vision of the digital order that China is offering, bite by bite.
Currently, the US and the EU have many open disputes on trade and tech issues. The majority are legitimate and they respond to different policy visions and interests. At the risk of simplifying, the US mostly approaches tech from a national security point of view, and it's mostly focused on China. Meanwhile, the EU is still trying to figure out how to balance the growth opportunities provided by new technologies with the aspiration to regulate digital markets and services under the highest ethical and right standards. The question is whether and how these two visions can be compatible in a way which does not only benefit EU-US relations, but the rest of the world. In my view, the only way to sort this difference out would be for both parties to always think on the global impact of the issues they're negotiating. In each field in which the US and the EU get it right and reach agreement, there would be massive spillovers effects over the rest of the world, which is hungry of enjoying the benefits of technological and digital change, but at the same time wants to see democracies and citizens being safe and free from third powers turning their progress into a vulnerability, or big firms eroding individual rights and grabbing too much market and political power. The goal of achieving technological sovereignty should therefore not be seen as a measure isolating or protecting us from each other, but allowing the wider community of democracies, whether consolidated or emerging, to create a safe and fair space in which to prosper. Let us then hope that in negotiating tech issues, the EU and the US do not miss the wood from the trees.
Thank you, Cara, Jose Ignacio, President Ilves, for joining us at this year's CEPA Forum. Before I introduce our distinguished panel, I'd like to thank again our supporters for this year's forum: Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. A special thank you to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. To our media partners joining us this year, Euractiv, Defense One, and Political. Thank you. And now, again, it is my pleasure to reintroduce our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, for our distinguished panel on ensuring a democratic digital domain. Over to you, Alina.
Hello. Well, thank you, Geisha, for that very nice introduction. Again, I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you tuning in from Europe, from the United States, and elsewhere across the world to this discussion on ensuring a democratic digital domain. We just heard from Eric Schmidt, who has some fascinating ideas to share about where democracies are falling behind countries like China and where we can still lead. This panel also takes time at a really interesting moment. We just had the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council, the so-called TTC in Pittsburgh in the United States, where the European Union and the United States have proposed a new ambitious agenda to cooperate in topics ranging from platform regulation, trade policy, export controls, and many other issues. And certainly, we're meeting today to have a conversation that has been ongoing as we've seen the rise of digital authoritarianism, data protectionism, disinformation, and many other challenges that are emerging from dual use capabilities of technologies. Certainly, we need much more transatlantic cooperation on this issue. And to really dig into so many different issues around this space, I am so delighted to be joined by leaders from across government, industry, and civil society to discuss the way forward on digital cooperation. I'm so pleased to have with us today Congressman Adam Kinzinger, the U.S. representative of the 16th Congressional District of Illinois, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Subcommittee on Europe, Energy and Environment and Cyber, who's been a very active voice on these issues. Congressman, thank you so much for being here. I also have Her Excellency Dita Haranzova, who's the Vice President of the European Parliament and member of the Renew Europe group, originally from the Czech Republic. Dita, thank you so much for dialing in from Europe. Great to see you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. And I'm also delighted to have with us Karan Bhatia, Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google, who's previously also served in government positions, including as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative under the Bush administration. Karan, always great to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Alina.
And of course, last but absolutely not least, I'm so delighted to see again Ambassador Eileen Donahoe, who woke up the earliest to be here at 6:45 Pacific time, as she is the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. And Ambassador Donahoe, of course, served previously to the United Nations Human Rights Council under the Obama administration. So thanks so much, Eileen.
Happy to be here, Alina. Thanks for including me.
It's our pleasure. So I just want to get right into it. We don't have a lot of time together. So Congressman Kinzinger, let me please start with you. You know, this conversation focuses on discussing how democracies can ensure that the digital domain remains free and open. And of course, in recent years, we've seen growing numbers of quite damaging cyber attacks, crime that has resulted in massive data breaches. We're still dealing with intellectual property theft on a daily basis, other losses related to malicious cyber activities. You have really been at the forefront of putting forward legislative ideas in your role in the House of Representatives on how to better improve things like cyber literacy, to counter future attacks. And most recently, you're one of the bipartisan co-sponsors of something called the Transatlantic Telecommunications Security Act, which seeks to work closer with allies, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, on digital issues and innovation. So let me put it to you to set us off. Where do you see the role of the public, of individuals in helping to mitigate increasingly damaging cyber operations? And what is the role of our European allies in this as well?
Well, you know, as a great philosopher, it was Spider-Man's grandfather said, power comes great responsibility. And so obviously when the internet came about and it's still in, you know, I guess kind of in a historical context, a fairly new technology, it's great power. There's a lot of information. We've seen how the internet and the cyber realm has done a great job in bringing freedom to people, right? You know, folks don't like to be oppressed. They have an ability to organize against oppression now, but we can also see how, you know, bad actors, Russia, et cetera, have taken advantage of that freedom. So I think it's like that great power, but the great responsibility piece is the thing I think we're struggling to get a handle on. And a lot of that and the role they can play in it, what it means for national security as well as their own personal security. But in terms of the Transatlantic Security Act, that is the main thing there is activating the government of the United States, the private sector of the United States, particularly through the Department of State, to work with our allies in Central and Eastern Europe to figure out how can we harden their defenses? How can we increase that education? Where can we have both government and private sector investment in this? Because look, I hate to tell you all, you see this, we're all fighting really the same battle. I mean, an attack on the US elections in 2016 is an attack on an election somewhere else in 2017. And this is going to continue until we stand up and fight back. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I look forward to a deeper conversation. And I think my opening thoughts on that is the bottom line is governments have to do better at coordinating. That's what legislation is for. We also have to do better at educating each individual user in terms of the dangers. So thanks for having me.
Well, thanks, Congressman, for laying out some of those initial ideas. And I very much appreciate you mentioning that we have to learn from each other, especially because not just in terms of future threats, but I think certainly many frontline states in Europe, especially in Central Eastern Europe, have been under attack, certainly from Russia in the cyber domain, the digital domain, disinformation domain. And I think if we in the United States had spent a little bit of time trying to really see the bigger picture and understand what our allies have been going through, we may have been better prepared to respond now. But certainly, I think this is a key moment for us to be talking about how we can better coordinate, how we can better work with the private sector as well. And with that in mind, I want to take it over to our colleague from Brussels, originally from one of the frontline states. Of course, that's Czechia, the Czech Republic. So Dita, MEP Haranzova, let me put it to you. You have been very much involved in your role in the European Parliament in helping to advocate for a digital single market across the entire EU space. Your portfolio includes a lot of issues having to do with tech policy, including telecommunications security. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about where Europe sits in this broader cooperation with the United States, but even bigger than that, Europe has certainly made the digital agenda and tech regulation a top priority. We often hear conversations around this being Europe's digital decade. But what does that really mean? Where is Europe's place in the world when it comes to this broader race for tech innovation? Where do you see Europe heading?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this really timely discussion. As we all know, this week a lot is happening in our bilateral relations between the EU and the US. And indeed, I am the one who keeps advocating that the future of digital Europe is to continue to be part of a global community and work with our allies, with the United States. This is the only way how we can really strengthen our competitiveness. And it has been already mentioned that we have to fight together because we have common challenges, and for common challenges we need to have common responses. But the words that I have just pronounced might not be shared by everybody in Europe. We have heard a lot about the American first policy, but what you can hear now in the Brussels language is sometimes something very similar. We don't call it Europe first. We speak about digital sovereignty, about the strategic autonomy. In other words, how to find a way that Europe can deal with some of these issues alone. And I very much hope that even so in some cases we will need Europe to do more on our side, still Europe will be open, and the openness will win. For me, we need openness and cooperation also from both sides of the United States. So I really hope that the statements that we heard this week can be really translated to concrete results for our businesses and for our citizens. Where I see Europe continuing to be a powerhouse for research and development and design, but I also very much hope that Europe can become a center of production again. But this is where the two sides of the debate are in conflict. If we take, for instance, the example of the computer chips, where both the US and Europe are facing shortages of chips. So the answers from both sides has been the same. We need to do more. We need to have production in our territory. And for me, the answer is yes, but. On one hand, what I don't want to see is that we artificially create state-funded enterprises. That's something which reminds me of the communist era where I grew up in the Czechoslovakia. What I think we need to do is to adopt some strategic reserve model for this problem, because we are not speaking about a problem of globalization. We are speaking about how to face current global crisis. So we can see very soon there might not be shortages in this market, and even so, I would even say that might be actually overproduction or flood of overproduction. So we need to deal with the crisis, not with some globalization problems. And as I said it, for me, the key is that we find our partner on the other side of the Atlantic, and maybe we also broaden it to other countries like Japan to work together with like-minded countries. This is the future that I see for Europe. This is the future I see in our bilateral relations with the US. So I'm very hopeful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dita. Let me stay with you for just a second. You already alluded to, all of us have alluded to these meetings that just took place in Pittsburgh, the TTC meetings. We've had a very long and detailed statement come out, bilateral statement come out from the United States and the EU. I wonder if you could talk maybe in a little bit more detail and really dig into where you see the top priorities. I mean, there's a long list. Now, you mentioned a couple of objectives, in the supply chains, maybe exports, things around manufacturing. but we have so many different issues facing us, including data flows and data privacy issues, where the United States and Europe still seem to be at odds. And I thought it was interesting that wasn't part of the priorities for the TTC. So given where we are now in these discussions, we just took the first step. What would be your top 3 priorities out of this very long list in terms of where we really need to focus our efforts between the EU and the United States in particular?
Thank you very much for this question. Well, my list will be definitely even maybe longer than the statement of this week is. I belong to the generation of the members of the European Parliament and joined the Parliament where we were actively involved in the TTIP discussions, which for me was the future of our relations. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to progress. And that's why I'm very happy to see the meeting of this week and that we are moving forward. There has been a lot of talks about whether it was a symbolic meeting, that not much happened, that there are not concrete deliverables. I would disagree. For me, I think this is a positive signal that even also after the disruption in different issues we have experienced recently, we managed to sit down and discuss. And also the fact that hopefully we will avoid to have agenda which is anti-China agenda, but that it's a positive agenda that will move us forward and that will actually deliver something. You have mentioned the data flow. It's just one part of the bigger picture. For me, it's the whole digital agenda, which I would like to shape with the United States. Of course, it starts with the data and with the trust that we need to build, but it also goes on with how we shape the artificial intelligence, how we shape the big tech giants together, what kind of standards we agree, because if we manage to agree with the United States, the rest will just follow.
Well, thank you very much for that detail. I'm sure we'll get more into those specifics as our conversation here goes on. But I do want to take it over to you, Karan. You have, of course, served in government. You now work at Google representing industry. But it strikes me that we are talking a lot about these very detailed areas of cooperation. Of course, that is what we have to do because we have some serious problems to solve. But I wonder if we're losing the bigger picture. To be honest, and I know Ambassador Donahoe will say a few words about this as well, we're in a battle over values. We're not just talking about export controls. We're not just talking about data sharing. Really, the entire democratic vision of an open, interoperable internet is under threat, and many would say it has already disappeared. And I think many companies find themselves on the front lines of this value struggle as they try to work in countries that are turning authoritarian, autocratic. And how do we really move forward here? So I was really happy to hear, both Congressman Kinzinger and now MEP Haranzova talk about what governments can really do here. But of course, we need the private sector involved. We need civil society and we need researchers. It's really all hands on deck. So I really wanted to get you to maybe take us out a little bit to a more strategic picture and to really focus in on what is the role of the private sector? How can companies and governments work better together to ensure that we're working towards our common shared values, democratic values and principles? Karan, please.
Alina, thanks so much. It's a great question. As you say, it's a big question. It's a strategic question, but it's maybe the most fundamentally important question. A few thoughts on this, but maybe sort of cut to the chase a little bit at the end first. I think it is gatherings like the TTC that happened yesterday. I was privileged to be in Pittsburgh and have a chance to participate in one of the panels with both the U.S. and EU leaders. I think it is through gatherings like this that we are going to be able to address, frankly, both the details, but also the bigger value issues. At the end of the day, convergence around those issues, which I do believe exists, but having them result in practical outcomes that can serve not only to align the transatlantic practices and market, but also serve as a model for the rest of the world, really is going to depend upon ventures like the TTC being launched and succeeding. And so I can tell you from our perspective, from Google's perspective, we've been very supportive of the TTC venture to begin with, and we're just thrilled to see it come off. And yes, the statement is broad, but that's because there's a lot on the table, and values play into a lot of different subject matter areas. But look, just to step back for a second to your bigger question, look, in many senses, this sort of cuts to the very heart of at least our company and why we exist. You know, we just hit our 23rd anniversary yesterday, or earlier this week. Our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And that is in not just a business prospect, that is very much a values laden mission. You know, making information available for everyone is really at the heart of what it means to have an open and interoperable internet. And yes, it is under challenge. It is under threat. I mean, last year, we've had more than 20 countries around the world suspend internet access. We've had dozens of countries pursue rules, policies, laws that would impact freedom of expression by addressing online content. So we do need democracies led by Europe and the United States, I think, to continue to stand up for internet freedom and human rights in the online space. So that, I'd say, is item number one. To your second point, I do think that we in the private sector have an important responsibility, an important role to play, and are committed to doing so. You know, just today we are part of a group of companies, a consortium, launching something called the Trusted Cloud Principles, and this is an endeavor to get leading Western cloud services providers to really speak with one voice about the importance of having free flow of data, of promoting public safety, of protecting privacy and data security in the cloud space. So that's an example, I think, of the private sector in action. I think, you know, also we've had the opportunity to work with the European Commission, for instance, on its code of practice on disinformation and the code of practice on hate speech. So these sorts of initiatives, I think, are also an important piece of what it means to tackle these sort of values-based challenges. The last thing that I would just flag is the internet today is not simply the large platforms. It's important that we recognize the critical role that it plays for small businesses, for workers, for users, so that they can be active participants in what it means to have an open and interoperable internet. And to that end, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face on both the sides of the Atlantic is building up the core competency, the digital skills that people need to be successfully engaged and safely engaged in the internet. And yesterday, I mentioned I was in Pittsburgh. It was for the chance to talk about one of our programs, something called Grow with Google, where we've helped more than 70 million people worldwide get the skills they need to be an active participant in today's digital economy. So those are just a few thoughts in response to your excellent and provocative question.
Oh, well, thank you, Karan. I know I want to stick with this values theme for a minute, but I want to bring in Ambassador Donahoe, and then I want to come back to you, Congressman Kinzinger, because I think all of the legislative efforts that you started talking about at the beginning of this conversation really rest on the notion that we have to do everything on that common basis of values. When we work with allies, when we reach out to our publics, when you talk to your constituents, as I'm sure you do a lot of, we have to keep reinforcing that we're all in this together. But of course, that's becoming more difficult, not just in the United States, but across all of our societies in Europe as well. So Eileen, Ambassador Donahoe, let me take it over to you. You and I have talked a few times about these issues, and you were really one of the first people that I've ever heard really make the case that when we're talking about technology issues, whether that's trade, whether it be export controls, whether that be questions around data sharing and cloud computing, all of that we are not just talking about those specific issues, that we're talking about how values travel and how they become ingrained in institutions and societies and what that really means, really these normative aspects of international trade, international relations. But of course, we've seen that under threat in some quite profound ways. I'll just mention the very recent example of the Russian government moving very aggressively now for years to put increasing pressure on any Western company working in Russia. Of course, China has been at the forefront of this. And how do we really make sense of our desire to still propagate values through technology, open democratic values, while at the same time, of course, the authoritarians are very well aware, which I find very interesting, that these kinds of technologies, that an open and free internet, are a deep threat to them. And they're trying very, very aggressively to repress and to push out the ability of any non-state controlled entity to be able to work inside their borders, or for any democratic government to really be able to have a real influence or presence. So let me take it over to you. I know I just said a lot there, but feel free to also respond to anything that's been put on the table to really get us thinking about how should policymakers in the United States and Europe respond to this really concerning trend.
Well, first thing I just have to say, you and I are so aligned on this. So you've just said so much of what I share in your thinking. First thing I would say is that, yes, obviously, diffusion of technology is a vehicle for diffusing values as well around the world. But I would go so far as to say this is not just a battle over the global open interoperable internet, which it certainly is, and a competition over that value and whether we're going to shrink back into digital sovereignty and a sort of more fragmented version. I would go so far as to say, the internet is really society. Our society has been digitized. So we're really talking about society writ large. And I would go so far as to say we are in a competition over governance models, and a digital authoritarian model is spreading around the world very rapidly, competing with democracy. So this is not really only a battle over the internet or technology companies. This is a battle over democracy, the future of democracy, and whether democratic governance will be the primary and the dominant form of government around the world. You mentioned the very dramatic episodes in the past week in Russia where Google and Apple were forced to basically take down an opposition Navalny voting app the day before an election, and basically forcing these Western companies to do things that are completely antithetical to their values and their vision and their mission of providing access to information and supporting democratic engagement. And it just shows how twisted it's almost like the whole vision of the internet, open internet, has been turned on its head in these authoritarian contexts. But they were pushed into this moral dilemma. Do you put your employees at risk of imprisonment in order to continue to serve the opposition in Russia? And oh, by the way, the standard line has been that the companies will do what is legal. And if something is illegal, they will not allow that content to show up on their platforms. That simple idea is getting very tricky, and isn't, because the authoritarians are making so many things illegal. And I feel like the dilemma ahead is, at what point do the companies pull out and provide no services to the dissidents and the opposition? And there's a lot of criticism from the human rights community about having pulled down the apps. But there's a point at which they are forced out of the country completely, and that's not a good picture either. So to your real question, what do we do? I really recommend that the US and the EU and democratic governments understand this battle, not really about just tech companies and how they operate in our societies or other societies. This is about system rivalry. It's not a bunch of discrete incidents that we have to find workarounds for. We are in a geopolitical and normative battle over the future of governance in 21st century digital society. And to the solution question, I think that the primary thing is you can't beat a system with nothing. You need a compelling alternative. And I do not think democracies have provided that compelling alternative. showcase what does it look like for governments to use and regulate data in ways that are consistent with their own democratic values. Where are we in the international normative arenas? China is flooding the zone and convincing the majority of delegations to follow, take on absurd interpretations of what human rights principles allow for, and, basically getting blessing for their use of repressive technologies, really repressive technologies in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, flooding the zone of standard setting bodies. And I have to say, last point for the EU and the US together, and this goes to the TCC, all of this starts with massive investment in technology. Dominance in technology, in AI in particular, quantum computing, those kinds of emerging technologies will translate into more power in every other arena: geopolitical power, economic power, normative power. So we have to win the technology battle. This is not about norms versus technology. It is both and. Technology is a vehicle for spreading and embedding our values. I'll stop there.
No, Eileen, thank you. That was a very powerful point that you just made. And I think that your point about multilateralism, and of course, how Beijing in particular has co-opted these institutions and bent them to their own service and has influenced others through so-called benign economic investments in many countries to now support Beijing's agenda at the political level in the UN, but also elsewhere. And that, I think, is something that we are waking up to just way, way, way too late. And Congressman Kinzinger, I was hoping you might be able to pick up on some of the points that both Karan and Eileen made. And I think especially about this conundrum, that we find ourselves in, where we have authoritarian states, of course that's Russia, of course that's China, but others are looking to these countries and seeing what they can get away with as well. And so now we're talking about these big countries, but that's not where the problem is staying, to be sure. And I think the Kremlin wants nothing more than to have no Western companies, no Western so-called platforms or technology companies that provide a space for the opposition to still, reach Russians inside the country, because we can't do that anymore because they've kicked us out. They've kicked out Voice of America and others. So this is the last open space. And yet, we're in this situation where, there is a moral dilemma here. So you obviously have the power sitting in Congress to raise awareness about these issues, to do more. I'd just love to leave it open to you. You've heard some of the other conversations. What do you think about the kind of challenge that we currently face on the values front? What can Congress do? What would you like to see the United States government do more broadly?
Yeah, look, it's a real issue. And I think, part of the problem is, I remember, I don't know, I was probably 14, I guess 13 when the Soviet Union fell apart. And the feeling at that point was basically, well, it's the end of war forever, right? It's the end of challenge forever. And democracies, there was a sense, I think the sense lasted until fairly recently, that you didn't even really need to nurture democracy. It was the natural end state of man. And so we were good. And then all of a sudden, quite honestly, Vladimir Putin and others have learned how you can take freedom. You can actually go from, instead of having a battle about capitalism or the free market versus communism, that doesn't matter to people anymore. What matters is authoritarianism versus freedom. And the most brilliant way to do that is, frankly, through stoking cultural differences and culture wars. You see that in the United States. Obviously, you see that around the world. And so, it does leave a conundrum, for instance, when Vladimir Putin says to Google, take down opposition sites, and Google does it. The problem is, and I get the conundrum of, should Google do that? Obviously, we want them to have a role, or whatever the tech company is. I don't mean to pick on Google particularly. You look at that and you go, okay, yeah, that's a difficult decision. What I worry about in the long run is what happens when you see in the United States. By the way, I think it was a brilliant thing to take down anti-vaccine kind of messages that are out there, for instance, on YouTube. However, I recognize there are people that are anti-vax, see that, and then see, in essence, whatever the technology platform is, succumbing to what China wants or to what Russia wants. And it creates a ton of dis-ease in the United States. And so I think if we're going to do that and take the position that, yes, we have to recognize that some foot in the door is better than no foot in the door, I think it's really incumbent on us to educate those in the United States, those in Europe, as to why this is the case. The problem is that's really difficult to do. Getting into depth in terms of foreign policy and those kinds of things is not easy. And I think that's where cyber literacy from the perspective of actually every user, every individual is extremely important. So they know when misinformation is being put into their face, when they know that there's something that's not true, and when they know that something that may look like CNN.com and is called something important like, United States news or whatever, is actually really Russian disinformation. And so I give our tech companies a lot of credit for dealing with this kind of new territory. And that's where I think we have to do a good job of both government and tech working together. Because the last thing we want to see, by the way, and I'll close my part with this, I don't want to see these tech companies run out of the United States because we, create such a hostile environment to them. It's not an easy answer, but we can make progress.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think you're absolutely right. We're just at the beginning of this conversation. I think we're just now recognizing the complexity involved from a geopolitical perspective, that this is not just about a U.S. interest, a U.S. national security. Of course, it is that, but that this is really a global issue. And then we're going to, every step that we take to try to ensure that our publics are better educated, that governments and government agencies, trusted agencies, we hope, are providing relevant information about everything from public health to what's happening across the world in Ukraine or elsewhere. That is going to be setting a certain precedent. And I'm really reminded of some of the early days of the debates we had about whether RT, this is the Russian state funded propaganda media outlet, whether that's the same as the Voice of America. Right, which is, if you look at it and you ask most people, this was funded by the U.S. government, that was from the Russian government. What's the real difference here? And of course, the difference is that one actually does journalism and is independent and provides real and true information, and the other one sells you a bunch of garbage. But I think that making that distinction, I think, is really important in these other issue areas. It's different. An authoritarian state is not a democracy. When we see the Kremlin or Beijing making specific rules, it is not in the interest of free speech. What we're trying to do is protect our public from misleading information and to open up more opportunities for free speech. So Karan, Eileen, I want to bring you back in to respond to what the congressman said and to offer any other thoughts before we wrap up. Karan, let me take it to you.
Thanks, Alina. Look, I first of all, I really appreciate both the Congressman and Eileen's thoughtful perspectives on this, and I don't disagree with almost anything that they've said. I mean, these are really hard issues. They are hard issues, frankly, for global companies operating in a lot of different spaces. They are particularly challenging when you are operating with the mission that we have, and frankly, the responsibility that we have. And I liked Congressman Kinzinger's opening. With great responsibility, with great power comes great responsibility, and we recognize that. Here are just a couple of thoughts. One is there are no perfect answers often when you are in the position that a company like Google or others are in, and you're often balancing multiple sort of pressures that have been alluded to. But what I will say is, at the end of the day, the question that we often ask ourselves is the world better off with the kind of access to information, objective access to information that a Google brings in a country than not? And we can debate that prospect, but from my personal perspective, I'm just speaking for myself here, I think the world is a better place with more access to more information the way we're able to bring it. Would we like to be able to do it perfectly in every circumstance? Yes, but even when we cannot, we do. Now, there are places, China as an example, where almost all of our services are not permitted to operate. So it's not easy everywhere, but I'd say that's sort of a base principle. The other thing that I would just say more broadly is we have seen the erosion of international norms and institutions in so many different spaces, right? We've seen the weakening of rules for market access, the WTO, to be honest with you, which should be an enabler of international services and trade in this space as in many others, just isn't what it once was or we would hope to have been. As an example, the problem there comes down not to companies so much or even to individuals, but it has got to be government stepping up to reinvest in, speak up for, defend and lead on international norms, international standards, international institutions. And so if it's not going to happen at that level, I worry that nothing that we're going to be able to do, even with the best education and all of that, is going to multiply changes. I would say this needs to rise to a very high level on the agenda. And lastly, just to go back and give a plug to the TTC, we can stare at the 10-page document, but let's not forget, these are two governments sitting down for the first time in recent memory to have a serious, wide-ranging discussion on technology. That's a good thing. That's an unmitigated good thing, and it is going to yield progress in some of these other spaces. So with that, I'll kick it back to you.
No, thank you, Karan, and I appreciate you really highlighting how important this first meeting was of the TTC, and it's really just a first step. But we're long overdue. We're very long overdue to have these kinds of conversations. Eileen, I want to take it over to you. You put out some big ideas there, and that's always the balance. How do we really strike that balance between seeing the bigger picture and the long-term game, which is really about values and technology? It's not an or, as you said. And then how do we at the same time focus in on some of these specifics? So I want to leave it open to you to respond what Karan has said or the congressman has said. Please.
So first, I'll just underscore the point Karan just made, which is we have seen an erosion of commitment to international norms, and that's the big concern. You mentioned geopolitical complexity, and the congressman really hit the nail on the head with his first example of talking about in the United States how anti-vaxxers feel about having their content taken down. And that's the really hard one, what's going on in this country, and how do we differentiate when YouTube does that from Putin's demand that a Navalny app is taken down? Because to Putin, the Navalny app is the disinformation. And so it goes to the question that I think he did raise, is how do we articulate the difference in a political arena, in a geopolitical arena? And I am now getting to the very bottom line, which is it's as simple as the difference between authoritarianism and democracy. That's it. That's what we've got. And people have to make their choices. And I think the Western tech companies are being forced further and further into that. Yes, you want to participate as broadly as you can in the world and move the globe in a direction of access to information and free expression. But at some point, there's a choice to be made. And this is where I hope the Europeans and the US understand we have so much more in common. And we are in this together. And it is a technology battle, and it is a norms battle at home, and it is a norms battle in the international arena, and we have to band together.
Thanks, Eileen. I'm really happy that we're have a more optimistic conversation. I think in the past, Eileen, you and I have certainly been in conversations where it's like a big downer when we leave. We think, what are we going to do? We have so much, but this has really been an inspiring discussion. And I'm so happy that we're able to leave with a point of optimism. I would love to carry forward, but I'm being prompted here that we're at time. I really appreciate all the time that you took to be here with us today, Congressman. Karan, thank you so much for all the work and the opportunity to hear from you and to get the industry perspective here. Difficult questions. And Eileen, always you're the visionary. Really appreciate your take. And of course, Dita Haranzova had to leave, but it was great to hear the EU perspective on these issues as well. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us for the CEPA Forum. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina, for that fantastic discussion. And now we move from ensuring a digital democratic digital domain to sparking innovation. I had the pleasure to speak earlier with one of Europe's leading innovators, Marcus Willig, co-founder and CEO of Bolt. Join me as we tune into the conversation. Over back to me. Hello, everyone. I am Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. Thank you so much for joining us for this special conversation on digital innovation as we continue to spotlight the innovators and thought leaders in tech from across Europe and the United States on day 3 of CEPA Forum. I'm honored to be joined by one of this generation's innovators and the youngest founder of a €1 billion company, Marcus Willig, CEO and co-founder of Bolt. Bolt is a global company that has gone well beyond its talent start and as a super app with 75 million customers in 45 countries and a mission to make urban mobility more affordable, safe, and sustainable. Welcome, Marcus, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. So Marcus, you started this company when you were 19 years old. And one of the things that I read that really stood out to me, partly because I appreciate the hustle, is that you yourself would go around recruiting drivers when you were just starting the app. What moved you to create Bolt at that time, at a time where it was quite risky?
Well, back then I was 19. I didn't know much about the world, but what I did know was that I was really passionate about technology. Coming from Estonia, I had seen how Skype had revolutionized the world of communication, and a big part of that team was based in Tallinn. My older brother Martin was one of the early employees there as well. So that really generated a huge level of ambition for me as well. That I realized that even coming from a small country like Estonia, you can make a difference in the world of tech.
So is there something that you identify in your early career or development, whether it was, mentorship? You mentioned that you work with your brother on this, or, is there a specific program, something that you can pinpoint, which has led to the success that you enjoy today?
I wouldn't say there was any one single thing, but it was probably a combination of many factors. One was that we had a really great education system already in Estonia for the last decades. One of which was that I was learning programming already in school as well. So I got the basic web development skills from those days. Second was that the country has always been very entrepreneurial. So as soon as we could and the Soviet era ended, people really got into entrepreneurship, and that's always been the culture that I've enjoyed. And my brother definitely has been a big inspiration for me on that front as well. And then lastly, probably it was just that the whole startup scene in Estonia has been exploding the last 10 years. We already have more than 7 unicorns in Estonia, and for a country of 1.3 million people, that's really extraordinary. So it's a combination of all of those.
That's what you just mentioned, 7 unicorn companies from Estonia alone. Just thinking through, I don't think that there is another European country where you could really pinpoint and see so much innovation coming out of today, really, that is having that kind of impact. So when you look,
basis, nothing even close.
Not even close, right? Which is amazing. But is there anything as that you would think that other countries could replicate? You just mentioned the education system is very robust and it drives innovation. Is this something that you think could be replicated elsewhere in Europe?
Absolutely. We've always had a very strong focus on the internet space over the last couple of decades. So that's definitely something that other countries can do as well. And secondly, the governmental services have always been digital. So it really already set a very high bar. In 2004, Estonia already got electronic voting, for example. So people have always been very used to adopting these kind of new digital services very quickly. And that, of course, translates over to the business side, which is that most people don't, for example, want to call old school taxi companies if they could use an app instead. So really, that was something that paved the way for us as well.
Which is fantastic. I think it's a mix of innovation, but also the convenience that comes with just having everything at your fingerprints. So really adapting to the customers versus, creating it in the middle of like in an empty space. I'm curious to hear a little bit more. We talk about this lag of innovation. I think a lot of the conversation in Brussels, has been focused on creating the space for European innovation through tougher regulation of big tech firms. One in particular is, of course, the Digital Markets Act. There's also the Digital Services Act. Do you think that this is an effective effort by the EU? To promote innovation in Europe or European innovation? And have you or your peers been engaged by Brussels at all as they're contemplating this kind of policy?
I'd say that in regulation, you need to be very surgical or very detailed. What are you trying to achieve? And talking about tech regulation broadly is usually not very helpful. I think it makes more sense to zoom into really the details of what are we talking about here, because tech nowadays touches upon almost every industry. So similar, I think, to how, for example, like oil companies or telecoms or financial sector has been regulated, you need to really go into the details. So specifically, I think that it does make sense in some cases to restrict the power that some of these huge dominant platforms have and to enable more competition, because in some cases it just is blocking new small European startups from actually competing. For example, if some suppliers are locked in exclusivity wise and they cannot work it with new players, I mean, that's of course restricting competition. But you really need to be very surgical and mindful, what are you trying to achieve, and not just try to like blanket block all of these big companies from existing. I mean, they do provide a lot of value to the ecosystem as well, of course.
And, of course, one of the things that we hear a lot from Brussels, but also in Washington, D.C., is that companies are often absent from the debate, right? So, I think, they don't come to the table in the same way that, civil society or other government players come to the table. Obviously, by participating in this conversation, you are engaging. But could you share with us what brings leaders like you to the table to have these kind of conversations? What should Brussels and to an extent Washington, D.C. be doing to engage?
Well, high level, I see broadly that most European companies already start off from a bit different mentality, and we are generally quite used to working with local and nation level governments to actually collaborate and see if we can actually improve the regulation as well, which I've seen to most of the US companies might not sort of seem as a standard thing of a do. So that's a mentality we always had from day one. But separately, of course, it comes down to what actually we see is the development. If we see the regulation is already trending in the right direction, there's no need for us to engage. If we see that actually the regulation that's being proposed is actually going to restrict economic activity and then not have the most benefit for the consumers and suppliers, then we see, of course, that there's a business interest, obviously, as well, that we want to engage and make sure that the regulation trends in the right direction. So lately, it's been more of the latter, where we see that, for example, on the transportation side, regulation has been artificially overly restricted. So, for example, on the ride-hailing front and then taxi regulation front, just artificially, there's some old school legacy laws there that are restricting the industry, causing some of the highest consumer prices and very poor service. And that just needs to be updated and brought to the modern 21st century. So there's a clear reason for us to engage and see whether we can update and then innovate on the transportation side as well.
But certainly this is the biggest conversation in Brussels, in DC, is all about tech and digital, especially vis-a-vis, what's happening in China. In the DC space, we are talking a lot about transatlantic cooperation on digital innovation and digital issues. So would it not make sense for this to be the time that you engage, even if it's going positively, to kind of add to the trend that this is the right move for companies like yours?
Absolutely, and that's actually something where we're taking in a bigger initiative on the last couple of years as well. So specifically on the food delivery side, we're actually now collaborating with other European players to actually propose proactively what we see could be the guidelines and then where the industry could be moving, rather than just passively wait for regulators to come up with their proposals. Because again, we see that there are changes needed, and it's our duty as companies leading in the space to actually propose and then move this regulation forward. So that's definitely something we're trying to promote to all the other European technology companies as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marcus. Now, I'm just fascinated by Bolt because it is well, first of all, it's just the fact that you started it at 19. So I'll start with that because at 19, I was certainly not there. But you started this company at 19. It started in Tallinn. Now you have a pretty vast operation in Africa. I just, how do you account for that trajectory where you're just, expanding so exponentially and globally? And it's a clear case to me of how Europeans can innovate and can have global impact. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I see the ambition level of entrepreneurs in Europe has just exploded massively over the last 10 years. I remember when I was starting, people were still thinking that, hey, if you grow the company to a size of a few hundred million in valuation as a proxy for size, I mean, that's already an awesome outcome. Now I see the ambition levels have grown tenfold and more. So nowadays, when I look at entrepreneurs in Estonia, they already dream of immediately going to dozens of countries and impacting millions of people. So that's been great to see. And then specifically, I hope that Bolt has also managed to show as an example that you don't necessarily need to move out from Central Eastern Europe. In fact, our legal and our physical headquarters is still in Estonia. We're relocating hundreds of people, extremely great talent from around the region into Tallinn, and able to show that you don't need to go to the UK, you don't need to go to Germany or US, but you can really build a global company that operates in 45 countries from tiny Estonia as well, and really set the precedent that more companies can follow that path.
Marcus, you say tiny Estonia, but even based on this conversation, I just find it sort of to be this giant presence in something that is going to be critical for years to come, which is, it's exciting, especially because CEPA has engaged for so many years across the Baltic states as one of our core areas of work. But another area that we focus on and that you kind of, just started unraveling there is our focus on the next generation of leaders. And we work really hard to try to develop, to provide platforms, to really give a voice to those that are up and coming, particularly in the policy space, but more so and increasingly on those that are working in the nexus of tech and policy, right? To ensure that as we're looking ahead, we have people that are educated about what happens in the sector, aid in making policy about the sector. And so would be curious to hear from you, what could institutions like ours, like CEPA and others that are working diligently to develop the next generation of leaders, what could we be doing better? And how can we continue to engage and really help young professionals develop?
There's, of course, a lot of components out there to unpack. One of those I see is fundamentally, actually, I see the trend is already very much in the right direction. Just looking at my own personal example from Estonia, over the last 2 decades, thanks to the success of Skype and the technology sector here, there's so many hundreds and hundreds of now experienced people coming out of these companies who are starting the next generation of companies. And then the sort of goes from there, and they bring and train up the next generation. And sort of this flywheel is already so strongly in motion across CE that's just within the technology space great to see. And I think one of the big things we need to be mindful of is that we don't somehow restrict it. So my biggest worry is that the public space and the government would somehow start to stop this great flywheel that's already in motion. So that's the first thing. Other than that, of course, there's many positive things that could be done. I see there's a lot of great youth programs going on that are supporting entrepreneurship in Estonia and across the region, that are just in schools, for example, already helping young kids set up their companies and experiment with that. So really, there's dozens of small initiatives like that could be done, and many of my friends who are now entrepreneurs have gone through programs like that.
That's fantastic, Marcus. Now, you said that you're worried that something is going to happen to stop this great trend that is, obviously on its way. So, what do you think? I think you hinted at it, but what do you think are the biggest hurdles to tech innovation in Europe?
One that we're already dealing with at the moment is just access to great talent, which is that when we look at where most of our engineering and product and operational leadership is coming from, then many of those people are coming exactly from countries in the region like Russia, Ukraine, and so on. And to this day, it's been relatively easy for this top amazing talent of people to move into Estonia and set up here and then really grow their careers. And that's something that we hope will also continue. But just looking at some of the developments in the region, I mean, you can see that immigration is always a hot topic, and it's not clear that this can continue and we can keep on growing our talent in the region here. So that's the first one. Second, again, is regulation, which is again very business and industry specific. But for us, we see that in the world of transportation, it's just been too slow. When we look at some of the Western European countries like Germany and France and so on, they're actually lagging behind Central Eastern Europe. So we see the innovation here, and the markets are far more open. And actually for companies like Bolt, it's so much easier to launch new products here, where regulation is far less of a blocker than it is in the sort of older, more traditional European countries.
And Marcus, you just pointed at something that I think is, and I said it while we were chatting, offline, is that not everybody knows or is as aware that there's so much happening in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to tech innovation. And that we really do need to bridge that divide of like Western Europe having these conversations, Central and Eastern Europe having these conversations, US having these conversations, partners and allies, just disparate. But, I wonder, as you look ahead, what would be the one message that you would give to folks in Brussels when it comes to the sector? What would be your biggest advice?
Biggest advice overall I see is that we really need to double down our investments into technology, specifically on the internet side, which comes in many layers. Of course, there's everything from education, but also financing of companies, where we see that still access to capital for many European companies continues to be far harder than it is for their US counterparts. So that's, again, even if after many years of talking about it and many moves on it, it's still something where we lag behind. And it needs to be a top priority, because it's very clear where the world is moving. Traditional industries are fading in importance, and tech, and specifically internet, is growing. So unless we bet on that and we do it aggressively, we're going to be left behind.
Fantastic. One of the things that I would love to ask, I have two, but I'll start with this one is, what would you say to anyone that wants to follow your footsteps? Any advice for them?
First is that don't expect this to be an easy journey. I think it already makes sense to go in with the right expectations that if you want to build something meaningful in the world, it's going to take many years. And the best advice I always give is that really pick a field that you actually truly care about deeply, because as an entrepreneur, you will run into many challenges, and it's in times like those where you need to come back to your core principles and think through why are you doing this. And specifically in our case, we went against some of the largest technology companies in the world who had raised billions of dollars of funding. We were coming from tiny Estonia with essentially no financing at all. And the thing that kept us going was that we really cared. We were that, hey, this is the mission we're on. We want to build better cities. We see that Bolt can make an impact to how millions of people live. And that kept us going.
Now, Marcus, the final thing, complete this sentence. The future of tech industry in Europe is?
In Central Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Marcus, so much for taking the time and for chatting with us again on day 3 of CEPA Forum. Thank you, Marcus. It's great to see you. And thank you all.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Marcus Willig, co-founder and CEO of Bolt, for joining me for that conversation, highlighting innovation coming out of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, I'm very pleased to share with you the results of our first poll here. How can the Transatlantic Alliance incentivize digital innovation? And by and far, it's invest in research and development. That is great, with regulate big tech being the second, but I think one of the things we learned is, really very much engaging in a whole society approach. Now, for the second poll, it's who is doing the most to secure a democratic digital domain? And the answers here are large technology firms, multilateral bodies such as the UN, the United States, the European Union. Please go to slido.com, use hashtag CEPA to participate in our polls, or scan the QR code and get to engage. As you're following the conversations, also be sure to use hashtag #FitToLead. Go to CEPA.org, CEPAForum.org, or follow us across all of the social media platforms to enjoy our analysis, content, or to re-watch any of the conversations from today. And now, as we begin to close out our program, I am so delighted to introduce the ministers of Austria, Greece, Spain, and Slovenia as they discuss their priorities for transatlantic cooperation on digital issues. Over to you, ministers.
Dear participants of the forum, distinguished guests, dear friends. My name is Mark Boris Andrijanic, and I'm the Minister for Digital Transformation of Slovenia. I joined the government less than 2 months ago to help my home country become the next tech star of Europe. I took this exciting yet frightening job after a decade spent in the US, Africa, and the EU. Most recently, I headed Uber's public policy in Central and Eastern Europe. Today, Slovenians have many reasons to be optimistic about the future. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of our statehood this year. Slovenia is a proud and constructive member of the EU and NATO. We are also holding the presidency of the Council of the EU for the second time in our short history. As proud Europeans, we strongly believe that Europe has many strengths, including its robust single market, openness to international trade, highly skilled workforce, and world-class innovation centers. However, the EU faces a major crossroad. We have been lagging behind the US and China in economic dynamism and technological progress. There are very few European companies among the global tech giants. Since we have no more time to waste, Slovenia decided a long time ago to elevate digital transformation to the very top of the EU presidency agenda. Together with our partners, we are working very hard to achieve meaningful progress on EU regulations in the area of digital services and markets, AI, and data governance. Europe has a historic opportunity not only to become the regulatory leader in the digital arena, but also to establish itself as the winner of the global AI race. The good news is that the EU is making significant progress on this and many other fronts. The creation of the European single market for data will be a game changer for European AI and digital economy. We're also increasing funding for strategic projects in AI and other technologies of the future. When it comes to regulating digital markets and services, our goals are ensuring fair competition, safeguarding our core values, and creating an environment that will breed digital champions of the future. We have to strike a delicate balance between autonomy and openness, which is a key value for the EU. That's why we developed the concept of open strategic autonomy, which will allow us to build some of our own digital and other capabilities while remaining as open and interconnected as possible. Of course, we are all aware of the global nature of today's digital space. That's why we believe that a strong transatlantic partnership is essential for tackling issues ranging from cybersecurity to AI development and tech regulation. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU and the US will never agree on every single detail, but we are bound by common values, economic interests, and strategic challenges. The creation of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council in June was therefore the right step forward, and the Slovenian presidency of the Council of the EU is committed to making it work. As said so many times in history, united we stand, divided we fall. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I wish you all successful and fruitful discussions, and please make sure to visit Slovenia someday soon. Thank you again, and good luck.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this annual forum of the Center for European Policy Analysis. It is undeniable that technological transformation is already a revolution that changes all areas of politics, economics, and society. Technology, innovation, and digitalization are shaping a new global order. In fact, we can talk about the impact of technological disruption in the global order in three main areas: power relations, the economic, labor, and social model, and individual rights and freedoms. Technology has not only transformed the nature of power, but also its balance and distribution among states. And what is more, non-state actors have a lot of power nowadays. So in this context, where implications of technological dependence are severe, I would like to briefly present the vision of the government of Spain on this matter. The first key aspect is national and European sovereignty. To prosper and maintain our independence in this new global order, we need to build a strategic sovereignty that must be a digital sovereignty. This means achieving technological independence in critical areas, specifically in the data economy. And this is linked to the second crucial aspect for Spain, the need to preserve our democratic principles and values in the digital era. This means a human-centered digitalization in favor of democracy and respect for human rights. This focus on people is a sign of identity of the digital transformation for the government of Spain and also for the European Union. Because this is not only necessary for protecting our democracies, but also a great opportunity to have a differential value and a competitive context. And also, we firmly believe in the need to update and adapt current legal, regulatory, and financial instruments in order to promote more actively European values in areas such as data protection, cybersecurity, and ethically designed artificial intelligence. For that reason, we are working together with our European partners in crucial aspects such as the proposal for the European regulation on AI. I would like to conclude highlighting one of the most important projects in Spain, the Charter of Digital Rights, a reference framework to protect our rights in the new digital reality, which includes specific rights, for example, on AI, the right not to be discriminated by an algorithm, or on newer technologies. This is a global challenge that requires the creation of new bridges and ways of understanding and cooperation between governments, working together for a human-centered vision of technology at the service of citizens and social progress. Spain and Europe have a firm commitment to this vision, and we wish to involve all countries with democratic convictions. A vision in which we will continue working from Spain for a fairer and better digital society. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to address the forum conducted by the Center for European Policy Analysis on democratic cooperation in order to enable digital innovation. It's true that democratic cooperation is a necessary ingredient in order to advance cooperation on digital, and this was very much underlined by the new needs that we saw on the ground by COVID-19. Greece is focusing on a very aggressive digitization agenda, an agenda that has the empowerment of citizens at its core, an agenda which focuses on service design, on simplifying and digitizing services of the state in order to further add and as a booster of trust vis-a-vis the relationship between the state and the citizen and the corporation and the citizen. But it's obvious now at the doorstep of the fourth industrial revolution and with all these new emerging technologies that we have already started seeing on the ground in day-to-day uses by both startups, corporations, and countries and states, that we need to inject our values at the core of this debate. This is a debate happening at the core of the European Union. It's a debate happening at every country in the world. How we will optimally regulate these technologies in accordance with our values, in accordance with our democratic systems, in order to facilitate the growth of these technologies and to have them act in the service of citizens. It's true that as we move forward, we need to place more focus in this debate in cybersecurity, in regulating artificial intelligence, big data analytics, and the regulation of 3D printing, in all these new emerging technologies and the applications of 5G. This is something which we have started doing significantly in Greece. On the one hand, we're focusing on closing the gap with all the outstanding issues of the past, with all the outstanding parts of the agenda of what we call the third industrial revolution, digitization. But we're also very much focusing on those new emerging technologies. We have already started rolling out our 5G network in Greece. We have put the Festos Fund, a 5G specific fund in place to act as a catalyst for the development of a 5G ecosystem in our country. But we also understand very deeply that we cannot afford to miss the opportunity to transition to this new era. Thus, cooperation is necessary. It's a necessary ingredient on all aspects of this agenda, on copying, on imitating, on being actually inspired by best practices happening in every other country in the world, in digital identity, in digital services, but also in cooperating vis-a-vis the development of those new regulatory options that we have in front of us in order to have those technologies grow, have those technologies move forward in accordance with our value system. This is at the core of what we stand for, and this is why, again, I believe that today's forum and today's agenda is essential.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, I'm very happy to join your event on democratic cooperation on digital innovation. It couldn't be more true, your motto of this event. We're in the middle of a change, a digital transformation. And beside the Green Deal, what we need is a digital New Deal. We need this for the next generations, not only in Europe, but worldwide. Digital transformation is key to solve the big problems of this world, be it nutrition, be it new forms of production, climate change, or education. With digital transformation and the new technologies that are available, I am convinced we can solve a lot of these issues, and not only for people living in the US or Europe, but for people living all over the world. A key technology, of course, is artificial intelligence. Here it is important that AI is always human-centric. We in Austria, we have launched a strategy on AI, and the human is in the center of this strategy. However, we need to speed up, and commonly we need to work together to make AI a good contribution to all our lives. AI can help us in the healthcare sector, AI can help us in education, and there are a lot of different applications and use cases of AI which we cannot even think of at the moment. Artificial intelligence is completely new to us. It will change the world, and it is a game changer. But again, I want to emphasize that human beings should always be in the center of these developments. It should always be to the good of people. What is important nowadays is definitely digital education. Digital skills are key, not only for the next generations, but also for the working generation, those who are in jobs now, but also for people who are already retired. This is a big challenge for Europe and the world, to take all people with us and to give them the digital skills they need. These are not only skills in communication, where COVID crisis has helped us to raise this level of digital skills in communication. But it's also about designing, it's about creative production of ideas in the digital world. Digital natives, of course, do have an advantage, but we need to have a look that this advantage is not only in communication. Digital transformation is key, and we need to take all people with us on this exciting journey.
Thank you so much, Ministers Artegas, Shambuker, Andrijanik, Impiriakis, for joining us and closing out this year's CEPA Forum. I am so delighted that now I have our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, joining as we reflect on 3 days of CEPA Forum galore, where we covered some very important themes that are really core to the Transatlantic Alliance, everything from, today on tech policy, digital innovation, transatlantic defense and security yesterday, and of course, kicking off with democratic resilience. So my first question to you is, what was your favorite moment of the forum?
Well, Geisha, it's so great to be here. It is the wrap up to CEPA Forum, and that's just so exciting. And we've had so many conversations over the course of the last 3 days that I still haven't fully absorbed what it all means. But I think for me, the highlights, because it's fresh, top of mind, I think the conversation with Eric Schmidt really was quite profound in terms of where democracies stand in this deep and growing battle for tech innovation. It was a little scary, but it was followed by a very optimistic discussion about how we can work together, that not all is lost, of course, as we look across to China, as we look to Russia and other authoritarian states who are challenging our values and principles. And I think, to my mind, if there was a message that we were trying to convey, and I think it came out very clearly over the course of the last 3 days, it is about our shared values and principles.
Right.
What was your favorite?
Well, I just, even as you say, like, it was our shared values and principles, it was about coming together. It's just been so fantastic to me to have these 3 days where you really see a community of transatlanticists showing up, and not just, I wouldn't say the usual suspects, but, we had so much representation this year. We had over 65, almost 75 speakers altogether in the 3 days from over 20 countries. I think this is the first time that we have Austria, Spain, Greece, so well represented across our forum. And so to me, that is a very big bright spot. It makes me very optimistic about the future of the alliance in these contested times, as the theme of our conference is. But I think truly that was a highlight. I will also say that for me, it was especially heartening to have President Maya Sandu actually kick off the forum on the Day of Democratic Resilience. You and I and many of our colleagues have worked quite a bit with Moldova over the years, and just seeing, President Sandu take this wonderful platform and really being the face for democratic resilience was just so lovely to my mind.
Absolutely. I think, Geisha, just to pick up on your point, and again, I think we're also absorbing everything that's happened. And of course, the globe and the world didn't stop moving. We had so many current events, the Trade and Technology Council meeting that just happened, the most recent debate about the new deal between the United States, Australia, and the UK. And I think the point that I felt that we got across, and I hope those of you in the audience who followed also got this, was that it's not just about who's in the EU or who's in NATO. We had representation from Moldova, from the UK, from so many other countries that show that we are a community. We had activists talking about the human rights repressions that are happening by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. We have to unite, not just across the Atlantic, but how do we now also start to build bridges on our common values from the Atlantic to the Pacific? And I think as we think about what the world is going to look like, these kinds of alliances whether they're happening in the structure of NATO, which of course is a critical base for transatlantic cooperation, or they're happening in the context of the EU. But we have to think more broadly. We have to build a broader coalition. And I think the kind of representation we had at CEPA Forum, with everyone really speaking with one voice on these issues, that was incredible. We did not orchestrate that. People could say whatever they wanted as part of CEPA Forum. That is part of the idea. But I really felt like so many different voices, government officials, people from the private sector, people from civil society, journalists, activists, we were all speaking in one voice.
And it just, again, even reflecting back the breadth of representation, thinking of, even the conversation that I had earlier with Marcus Willig, having private sector, having poets, having the next generation of leaders. That's also reflected in a lot of, what we've been working on to build out CEPA for the last year and a half. So having so many of our fellows, I don't know if you also felt that way, seeing so many of our fellows, so many of our senior fellows, so many of the next generation, really, speaking passionately about the alliance and what matters to them and what unites us. That was very heartening in these times.
Yeah, and CEPA is a young organization in so many different ways. And the people that joined CEPA as our senior fellows and staff, we have a really interesting mix of a diversity of generations that I think is very unique. When we think about where are some of the more concerning trends that we often hear about, that a lot of younger people don't value democracy, don't understand the value of democracy, are more open to authoritarian rule or even ideas. I think here we see that the transatlantic torch is still very much alive and burning. And I think CEPA has been one of the organizations and a leading voice in carrying that torch to the next generation and passing it for now generations to those who are coming up. And I think that's the key here. It's how do we build bridges across the Atlantic, bridges across Western, Eastern Europe, Northern and Southern Europe, and also the same kinds of bridges across the generations. And that for me has been really exciting part of this forum.
No, truly. Is there something, Alina, throughout the conversations, is there any one, saying any one comment that really, either shifted your thinking on a particular issue, or that, made you see something in a way that you had not considered before?
I do think the provocative conversation that we opened the forum with between former National Security Advisor General McMaster and one of our senior fellows, Bobo Lowe, as well as Daniela Schwartzer from Open Society Foundation, it really made me stop and think about the international community and what do we really mean when we say that. And I think McMaster's comment that this is an illusion, and we really need to think about what unites us and really need to think about coalitions in a different way. That we need to not use jargon, but really look concretely where we can work together and how. Conversations that followed about how do we involve non-traditional allies, especially when we're talking about technology and digital issues. This is not just the work of governments. It's not just the work of the private sector. We all have to work together. But I think that initial conversation, which I encourage everyone to go back and watch, because I think it was one of the most provocative conversations I've heard at a conference on policy in a long time, will make you stop and think.
Right. Is there anything, and by the way, I think that I would also spotlight that as being one of my favorite conversations because it was provocative. It was thought-provoking in so many different ways that I had not considered before, and just, really set the scene for the conversations to follow. I would also say that, reflecting on this idea that democracy is not a destination, it's a journey, was really well represented across the 3 days. When you think about that wonderful conversation that you had with Carl Gershman, where he reflects on 40 years of service, does that, having that opportunity to talk to him, does that make you provide you with further optimism for the future, just kind of seeing the ebbs and flows of democratic movements?
It's a great question. I think maybe this will be my last comment here. At the end of the day, there's a lot to do. There's no question about that. We're not as united as we once were. Countries are going their own way. There's conversations happening in Europe about Europe's own path forward. There's conversations happening among allies in terms of trust and reliability. What can we do more? What do we have to do less? We can't do everything. How do we prioritize? And so I do think there are real issues here, issues around tech regulation. Of course, we're moving in the right direction, I think, but there's so much to be done. And so the challenges are real. There's no question about it. But I think what we're seeing now is that what the alliance really is about, when we kind of dig deeper beyond our collective defense and security, the values that unite us, as even issues around digital cooperation, it's really about people at the end of the day. And I think that was also very clear to me, that a single person can make a huge difference. And I just wanted to mention that I was so personally happy that we were able to do a remembrance of someone who was very important, and that was Jim Denton, who not everybody knows, but he was one of these people who really worked behind the scenes to bring people together. And he understood that a single person can make a difference. And to me, that was a big takeaway. He made a difference in my life. I hope others see themselves as agents of change for other people, and at the end of the day, that is the alliance. It is people who know each other, who make connections, who then make decisions together, who know each other based on a basis of informal chats here and there. And of course, we missed so much of that during the pandemic. And we continue to miss that. But I really see that there's a change coming this year, next year, and a recognition of that it's the people connections that really matter here. And that's really important for all the conversations we have about big ideas, concrete policies, and everything else.
Yes. Yeah. So the last question I'll ask, so that we can, close out these 3 days that I think we'll continue to reflect on for months to come, is how will CEPA, you're leading our organization, how will CEPA address some of the key questions that have come up through the discussion? What is the future of CEPA?
Well, the institution's mission, I think today, remains far more relevant than it was when we were first founded about 16 years ago. We have so many challenges that I mentioned. And I think as an institution, it's on us to be the bridge, to bring dialogues closer together, to bring greater understanding, to be an explainer of different perspectives, and to really set the agenda on the policies that serve our national security in the United States, but that serve the broader transatlantic security. And so to my mind, we are, as an institution, the torchbearer for these values and principles, and we have to double down on values and principles. The leading with our values cannot be compromised, that it has to be at the forefront of our mission, has to be at the forefront of our analysis and research. And these are nonpartisan questions. They're nonpartisan issues. We need to have support for our broader transatlantic alliance, and we do have it in a bipartisan consensus here in the United States. I think when people read the media, it sounds like everyone's fighting, and that is true. That is part of our very polarized political landscape. But I think at the end of the day, when we really sit down, you ask the deeper question about what matters. What matters in terms of who we want to work with? The answer is clear. It's our European partners and allies. And I think when you sit down with your friends, who may not care about foreign policy or know much about it, and you ask, would you rather live in a democracy or would you rather live in an authoritarian state where you're constantly being watched and surveilled, which is what the reality is in China today? I think the answer will be clear on that very basic level. And from that, this is how we grow a greater understanding, greater cooperation, greater collaboration. And CEPA, to my mind, over the years, has already been an incubator of the next generation, and will continue to be that, the torchbearer for values and principles, and the understanding that we have to fight. We have to think about what can we really do together. We have to have everyone at the table, governments, private sector, activists, civil society. And I'm just so proud of everything that we already accomplished together.
Very proud indeed. And so I think that is a lovely note to end on. Of course, the CEPA Forum is done, but our work continues. And so I encourage everybody to, continue to follow our work, going to cepa.org, following across social media platforms. There is so much coming out from all of our fellows, all of our thought leaders here at CEPA. And we really hope that you will continue joining us and, as we address some of the key challenges facing the Transatlantic Alliance. And I just want to thank again our supporters for this year's. Oh,
I don't mean to interrupt you, Geisha. But before we get to closing out, thanking everyone we got to work with this year, which is an incredible group. I want to make sure that we have a moment to thank all of the CEPA staff who've been working behind the scenes for a very long time to make all of this possible. And if I told anyone how tight our team is to be able to do something as big and as interesting substantively as the CEPA Forum, I think most people would be shocked. So I just want to thank everybody that has been working on the comm side to be able to produce the CEPA Forum. Michael Newton is sitting behind the camera there. You can't see him, but I can, and I don't think he's slept in weeks. Carlota Nunez, who actually works from Europe and has been such a great part of the team. Amelia Martin, who has also been working hard behind the scenes, and you can't see her, but I've seen her quite a bit throughout the last several days. And everyone else from our Democratic Resilience Program, Transatlantic Defense and Security Program, Transatlantic Leadership Program, and of course, a Digital Innovation Initiative. Every single person talking about people matters. People matter. This is it. This is the team that has made all this possible. And I'm just so grateful for all the hard work, and I think it's really paid off. So thank you, Michael. I see you there. Thank you, Amelia, Carlota. Thank you, Geisha, for really leading this, all these discussions and really being the face of the forum, and everyone else that has, really put in the time and the hours to make all this possible.
Of course, Alina, of course. It's people matter, and we have an incredible team of very passionate people, and it's just been a delight. So I hope that is reflected in all of the conversations over the last 3 days. And so with that, I'll thank our media partners first, Defense One, Euractiv, and Political, our production partners, Slides Live, for all of their work in making sure that we can carry out this fantastic forum. Our supporters, Bell Helicopter, Craig Newmar Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Microsoft. And a special thank you to our colleagues at the Lithuanian Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the Slovenian Embassy in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. And that is a wrap on CEPA Forum 2021. See you next year.
I wish you a